Success Insight shares the stories of the people with passion and drive who make things happen in the world. Here's your host, Howard Fox.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Success Insight podcast. Our guest today is Dr. Gordon Curphy. Gordy is the managing partner at Curphy Leadership Solutions. He attended the United States Air Force Academy, has taught leadership at the Academy, and obtained a Ph.D. in industrial and organizational psychology from the University of Minnesota. Gordy has over 30 years of education and experience in a wide variety of leadership matters. He is a prolific writer and has authored over 21 books, as well as numerous book chapters, articles, white papers. He's even developed assessments, which I hope we talk a little bit more about, on leadership in teams. And just this last month, he and his co-authors, Dianne, Nilsen, and Robert Hogan. Now, Robert Hogan's name is familiar to me, and there's a connection between Gordy and Dianne. He'll share with that in a second. But we're going to learn a little bit about this new book, Ignition, A Guide to Building High-Performing Teams. Gordy, it is such a pleasure to welcome you to the Success Insight podcast.
Thanks for having me, Howard. Appreciate it.
I don't recall exactly how we came into each other's paths or sphere of just awareness of each other, but I do see we connected on LinkedIn a long time ago. And I think as I was going through leadership development, graduate studies, and I got my coach training, I just think you've been on LinkedIn, you've been doing this work in industrial organizational psychology for years. And I suspect that's where it was. So when I saw the book, Ignition, A Guide to Performing High-Performing Teams, I just knew, I think it's time. I've got the venue, got the modality, the podcast. Let my audience learn a little bit more about you and your work. Tell us just a little bit of the high points of the journey, and so then we can kind of get into the work you're doing today.
Well, yeah, as you said, I ended up going to school at the Air Force Academy. I left when I was 17 to go to school. That was interesting because that experience got me interested in the notion of leadership, followership, and teams. Going to school at a military institution really does emphasize those concepts and emphasizes it early on. After that, I spent a career in the military, some of which was teaching at the academy, and was kind of interesting. When I was in school, I didn't say a word ever in class. And in reality, I'm a raging extrovert. But in class, I never said a word ever. And people who knew me, I played ice hockey when I was at the academy. And so people who knew me knew I was a raging extrovert. And when it came time to select me to go back to the Air Force Academy to teach, there was some consternation among the faculty about me being too introverted to be able to actually command attention in a classroom. Little did they know. But what was really nice about coming back to the Air Force Academy is I really got a love of teaching and really liked working with the cadets, really liked being in a classroom. Since then, I've probably trained 20,000 leaders over the course of my career. So the classroom is something I still love. I don't do nearly as much of it as I used to. And that whole classroom teaching experience got me interested in writing our first book. So that was really a college textbook about leadership. And it was about giving folks who were teaching leadership the resources necessary to teach others how to lead.
Okay. What was it about teaching in the classroom that really got your juices flowing? Now, realizing you're a raging extrovert, I'm a raging introvert who has to play an extrovert. So you and I we have some similarities with each other, but some differences.
There's a couple of things. So one is, I think in the classroom itself, it's when light bulbs go on, where people see connections and they start asking very insightful and piercing questions, where they start piecing it all together. That to me is very, very rewarding. But what's been interesting over the last 10 or 15 years or so is seeing a number of my ex-students now become CEOs, presidents, CHROs, chief learning officers, just see them highly successful. I was just on the phone last night with one of my ex-students who's a CEO and president of a business in Western Michigan. And it was just great talking to Dave and what he was doing and how he was kicking butt and taking names and what his next career move was going to be. So it's just nice maintaining those longer term relationships with people.
Excellent. And I wholeheartedly agree about the idea of the light bulbs going off. A coaching mentor of mine used the analogy of light bulbs, the pop, pop, pop going off. And And I have to share, even like during this podcast, when I'm interviewing a guest and I'm listening, but I'm also thinking to myself, the story they're telling is familiar. I get it. They need to meet somebody else, another one of my guests, because I love making connections. And I think that's been the best part about more so this work now in the podcast and even in the coaching profession, because we can't do it all by ourselves. We do have to rely on others to collaborate with to accomplish what the client needs. But the the relationships and looking at the connections and most certainly 30 years of education and consulting, coaching, you've built a lot of relationships and you're so right. I mean, just seeing the people that you've either helped or somehow they've come across your path to see their successes, that's when you really know what I've been doing in my life has been totally wonderful. So that's a great feeling.
Yeah, and I think there's been several mentors I've had in the past, and one of the things that they were exceptional at, and I suspect you're the same way, Howard, is they're very, very good at paying it forward. They were just really good connectors, like you had said, and said, I don't know if Gordy really has a need to talk to this person, but they need to know they need to connect. They need to get to know each other, and probably something interesting is going to happen there. And I've had two mentors who are very much like that, very, very well networked and very deliberate about connecting people where they thought interesting things would happen. And they usually do.
I'm curious too, in looking back at your career in industrial and organizational psychology, that term, that field of psychology came onto my radar way back in my undergraduate days at college. And I wish, two things. One, I wish I had gone into the Air Force too. I think life would be just a little different because I could have used that rigor of being in that type of environment. But the topic of industrial organizational psychology in the classroom was just very interesting. Life happens, we go down, take different paths, and sometimes we eventually come back to the beginning. But this idea, the topic of psychology and industrial organizational psychology is very interesting. And for our listeners, those that are not psychologists, I'm sure that you could probably spend an entire class semester on what is industrial organizational psychology or IO psychology. Is it possible within the span of just a couple of minutes to kind of give a broad stroke of this is what this industry is, this is what I do, this is how I use this modality of psychology?
Yeah, pretty easy. When all is said and done, all IO psychology is the study of people at work. We have clinicians who look at people who are suffering from mental disabilities or may need some in-depth counseling help, in contrast with industrial organizational psychologists who end up looking at people at work. In a very practical sense, it has to do with how do you end up hiring the right people? How do you end up developing them? How do you end up motivating them? How do you end up engaging them? How do you end up evaluating their performance? How do you end up rewarding them? How do you end up determining who should get promoted and who shouldn't? Just about anything you can think of with respect to work involving people usually will involve IO psychology in one way or another. Now, it may not be labeled IO psychology. Maybe here's a training program, but most good training programs or most good performance management systems all have their underpinnings in IO psychology.
Okay. I was on a training call this morning with an organization. It's called WBEX, World Business Executive Coaching Symposium. And a gentleman, David, his first name is David.
David B. Peterson?
It was not David P. Peterson. Part of me wants to go and look what it is. It was not Peterson, but that David and then this other David started a program of training coaches and new ways about leadership. And the topic today was on the rise of artificial intelligence and machine learning and how it affects or will affect the coaching profession. And I'm curious, in the years of practicing as an industrial organizational psychologist, a consultant, a coach, a mentor, what's changing in the profession now? Is there stressors on this profession, or is it going to continue to grow as we evolve and our definition of work changes?
Oh, I think it's going to continue to grow and evolve. If you look at all the different fields of psychology, IO psychology is by far the fastest growing because typically, if you go to a good IO program, you have a really extensive statistics background. So I had 14 Ph.D. level classes on statistics and something called psychometrics. A lot of that quantitative background lends itself really well to marketing now. So when you start talking about big data, many times you'll see IO psychologists playing a role in that just because they have the quant background to be able to analyze that data. Things with artificial intelligence may shift in terms of how world works. But on the other hand, people will all still be involved with getting things done, and there'll still be training requirements, there'll still be evaluation requirements, there'll still be issues around promotion and who gets to make what calls and how do you assemble a team. That will all still involve IO psychology. What people are actually doing could vary quite a bit, but some of the basic ways in which we select and evaluate and develop people, they'll still be there. They'll be modified with the technology, but they'll still be there.
Okay. By the way, it was David Goldsmith.
Yeah, I don't know David Goldsmith. Yeah. David Peterson is another big name, and I went to graduate school with David Peterson, so that's why I was wondering about that.
We learned about Peterson's pipeline. I'll always remember that, the leadership pipeline.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, the developmental pipeline.
Yes.
Yep, that David B. Yeah. So David and I worked together at a company called Personnel Decisions International, and actually I went through one of David B. Peterson's very first coaching classes.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah.
Small world. Well, again, I think just given the nature of your work and how long you've been doing it, you've probably have met many of the who would be considered, from my perspective, as icons at least in the coaching profession. I'm curious about within IO and the work you're doing as we get into Ignition, your book, this idea of there's individuals and then there's teams. And one thing it just continues to strike me is that all of the leadership programs that are out there, all of the professional development programs, coaching programs, psychology programs, all the companies out there who, assuming they've got a decent budget, are investing in the development of individuals, hopefully teams, that we still have the troubles inside the organizations that we have. It's like we're one modality or way of developing employees or teams is popular today, but then another officer comes in the organization, he or she has their preferences and everything gets churned around again. I guess I'm curious. My sense is organizations aren't really becoming high-performing teams. I mean, I'm really, from my perspective, that's what it's boiling down to. And when we talk about it, I guess my question I would ask you, are organizations that you're seeing actively engaging and becoming high-performing teams, or are they just paying it the lip service? What are you seeing?
Well, the research is pretty clear that teams are everywhere. I mean, every organization you see has probably got teamwork or collaboration on part of one of its corporate values or corporate principles. Everybody believes teamwork is important. Organizations are made up of tens to hundreds to thousands of teams. And what's really interesting is organizations can tell you what their revenues look like, what their margins look like, what their headcount looks like, how much they pay for payroll. They can't even begin to tell you how many teams they have. You work with any large company, more than 10,000 people, they have no idea how many teams are in their organization. Yet they all believe teamwork is really important. And when you start peeling back the onion a little bit, you start to realize that organizations do a number of things inadvertently that hinder rather than foster teamwork. We have over-indexed on the individual to a great extent. As you talked about with leadership development programs, most leadership development programs focus on two things. They focus on self-awareness. We're going to give people personality or 360 or values feedback, some sort of feedback to help people understand who they are and how they're seen by others. And then there'll be a series of modules many times that will involve, say, coaching others or managing performance or communication or interpersonal relationships, influencing without authority. Those modules very much encourage what I call a hub and spoke model of leadership. What I mean by that is they're very much intended to, here's you as the leader dealing one-on-one with a follower, with a direct report. All right, so I'm going to work with this direct report. I'm going to practice my listing skills. I'm going to work with this direct report and practice my delegation skills. Very few formal leadership development programs, whether they be in executive ed or in a corporate university, or in many of the training programs I see done by large consulting firms, talk about what the leader needs to do with the collective team. How do we work with a group of people? I'm running 10 people. I'm working one-on-one with these people, but at the same time, I got 10 people I've got to get working together towards a common goal. We don't provide that training. Very, very few. So it's no surprise that most teams and organizations fail because, or certainly are not hitting on all cylinders because we don't train leaders how to build teams. We don't give them feedback about how their teams are actually performing. We don't reward them for doing a good job with teamwork. We don't promote people who have a track record of building teams.
Very interesting. How has your work, and I mean, especially this new book, Ignition, A Guide to Building High-Performing Teams, how are you, along with your co-authors, and please talk a little bit about who your co-authors are, because definitely one of those names is very familiar to me. How is this work of yours and theirs in this new book, how is this serving to change the conversation, to go from focusing on the hub and spoke to the collective, the team, whether it's a permanent team, intact team, as Lencioni might say, or a project-based team? Because I think project-based teams still have to learn how to get along to accomplish things as well.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so let me talk about the two co-authors first. I think many people know R.T. Hogan. Bob and I go back almost 30 years now with an article I think we wrote in the mid-90s for American Psychologist on personality and teams. And anybody who does any work in the personality space will be very familiar with the Hogan suite of products. Bob has been a mentor to me. I probably learned more about leadership from him than just about anybody else. Well, I have from anybody else. He is just absolutely brilliant when it comes to human behavior and to leadership. He thinks about it all the time, and he's incredibly insightful. And every time you're around him, he just gets you to think.
That's good.
Which is good. He just gets you to think. Dianne Nilsen is our second author. Now, Dianne and I, in all fairness, are married. We actually met in graduate school. Dianne is also a fellow Ph.D. in industrial organizational psychology. She spent 11 years working at the Center for Creative Leadership, where she designed their top line 360, which is called Benchmarks for Executives. Dianne was the author of that, as well as worked on a number of other different tools that they had at CCL and that CCL still uses. Then she worked for a company called Personnel Decisions International, where I also worked, where she was the head of R&D and a head of their 360 business, and then was an account executive. And more recently, she was a COO for a company that ended up working on customer satisfaction surveys, employee engagement surveys, and 360s. And then a few years ago, I got her to join the dark side and work with me. And so the two of us together are both managing partners at Curphy Leadership Solutions. Really, the idea behind the book, there's a couple of things. As I mentioned earlier, Howard, I think I've been talking and teaching and researching leadership for a long, long time. And I think we really have over-indexed on the individual. We spend a lot of time getting the person to understand who they are and what drives them and how can they be more effective, to the exclusion, oftentimes, to the team. And so one is I thought we sort of over-indexed too far on the individuals, and I thought we had to bring teams back into the conversation because leadership ultimately is a team sport. Secondly, when I thought about teams, and we think oftentimes about team building, almost always the default position is, well, we better bring somebody in from the outside to help the team. Apparently, building teams is something that leaders are incapable of. That was kind of the common thinking, I think, for a long time. We got to bring in somebody who can do a ropes course. We got to bring in somebody who can do X, Y, and Z. And usually it's some sort of fun games and activities, which oftentimes don't have much impact. So I thought the way you build teams is by having teams do real work. And we've got to be able to teach leaders how to build teams. That should be a fundamental skill they pick up and should master, just like many other basic leadership skills we expect them to have. And so as R.T. Hogan and Dianne and I got together, it was like, okay, let's build a system or a framework where we can teach leaders what are the critical components of teams, which is the rocket model. How do we give them feedback on how their teams are doing, which is our team assessment survey? And then how do we give them practical guidance and support so that they can actually go out and help improve how their teams are functioning, which is where Ignition and our downloadable support materials come in. So we tried to create a complete package for team leaders and team facilitators to help teams get to the next level of performance.
So this book really is for the consumer, and it's designed to give them a path to not only understand the concept and the importance of team, but how to create one.
Yeah, it's a how-to book. We've got a couple of, I would say, introductory chapters to just talk about the different components, the rocket model, the team assessment survey, the book, what we call our team improvement activities. And then we have a number of other chapters that are all dedicated to specific team challenges, like how do you launch a new team? How do you combine teams after a restructuring? How do you work with a virtual team? How do you manage a matrix team? I mean, people have those questions about, I got this team I'm running, or I'm about to take over a team. I just got promoted. How do I do that right? Or how do I onboard a new team member? So what the book is designed to do is very, very practical and says, okay, here's the tools you have available to you with the rocket model and the team assessment survey and the guidance in our book and our team improvement activities. Here's how you actually resolve that particular problem. Here's what you should be looking for. Here's what's going to happen. Here's an actual offsite design. So if you're launching a brand new team, here's the design you can use to help this team hit the ground running as quickly as possible. You don't have to use it, but at least you've got something to start from.
It's definitely wonderful uses to give people at least a path forward. You know, I would think of this book as it's not the lifetime, here's everything you need to know about teams, but here's the starting point. Understand these concepts. Here's some ideas, things you need to follow. And then if you need help, well, then they obviously they come back to you. They come back to other coaches who are familiar and can support them, masterminding even. I mean, if you're struggling to build a team, you need help. You want to see how other people are doing it. And I think that's wonderful. You've mentioned the rocket model a couple of times, and I'd want to at least ask you if you wouldn't mind, just acknowledge for our audience, what is the rocket model? Because I think I love models, I love assessment, psychometrics, but they'd like to know.
Yeah, the rocket model, if you look at the team research, Howard, it doesn't cohere very well. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of good research going on, there's a lot of good work going on out there, but people are looking at like, well, what's the impact of team size? What is the impact of team conflict? Where does psychological safety come into play? How do team goals drive a team? All really good work, but none of it fits together. Nobody's looking, say, okay, well, how does this impact this? How does all this stuff relate together? And so what we did with the rocket model, starting about 20 years ago, was saying, okay, let's put together a framework where we can tuck in this different research that's consistent with what we know about teams, but then also makes sense to practitioners, people who actually have to build teams. When you look at it, you say, I get it. I can see right now, here's where this team is coming up short on this model. So the model's got 8 components. The components are interrelated. And very quickly, the components are context, i.e., what's the situation surrounding the team, mission, what's the team's purpose and goals, talent, who's on the team, how big the team is, what skills do they have, norms, what are the rules by which teams get work done, buy-in, what's the level of motivation on the team, resources, the 6th component is all about data, budget, authority needed to get things done. Courage is the psychological safety component of the rocket model. And then results is the dependent variable. What do we actually get done? Are we moving the needle? And 99% of team problems are going to fall into one or more of those buckets. You're going to have a problem with unclear goals, ill-defined roles, bad decision-making processes. It'll fall somewhere in that model.
So when you go into a project or maybe it's the leader, he or she knows they need to do something, they come across the book, is the idea before you try to fit the pieces into this model is to, as you put on the outs, the kind of like the overarching encapsulation here is the context. You need to understand the context of what the problem is or what you think the problem is. Sometimes it's not always, problem is not always the problem. Figuring out what that is And is this where the team assessment survey comes in to measure, or is that another step in the process?
Well, it's related. I did 5 calls today with leaders on running a $1.7 billion business. All right. So 30-minute interviews. And what much of the interview focus was on, well, tell me about the history about the team. Tell me who the team's biggest customers are. What's happened with this business over the last few years? What's happened to the team composition over the last few years? Who are the key regulators? What's happened to market conditions? Who are the key competitors? This is what you're talking about when we talk about context. It has to do with what's the situation facing the team, and more importantly, what are the key challenges facing the team? And what you end up finding is people assume everybody's looking at the situation the same way, when in reality, they are not. I will tell you, if you've got virtual teams, you've got diverse teams, people do not look at the situation the same way. They look at customers differently. They look at competitors differently. They look at headquarters differently. And it's not that anybody's right or wrong. But what you want to do is have a conversation to say, okay, let's get on the same page about what's going on here. Let's agree upon what our common assumptions are for the situation and what our common challenges are moving ahead. Most teams do not have that conversation. To me, whenever I'm working with a team, one of the first things we try to do is just level set about what's the situation facing the team. What are the challenges facing the team?
Okay, fair enough. We've spent a fair amount of time, and we really appreciate you taking yours to spend with us on the Success Insight podcast. And we would love our listeners to learn more about you and your work, and especially if they are in organizations and they're in those organizations, there are teams, and perhaps they need someone or a new way to look at the teams and what their context is or their issues are, and need someone to talk to. So what's the best way for our listeners to learn more about you and your work, Gordy?
Well, I think the best thing to do is to go to our website, which is www.therocketmodel.com. One of the nice things there is you can download a 5 or 6 page white paper that we've built that gives a quick description of the rocket model, the team assessment survey, ignition, how they all fit together to help organizations and teams be more effective. And in there, you'll see more information about how to reach me directly if there's more information needed. Also, I'm pretty big on LinkedIn. You can always leave me a message on LinkedIn also. I tend to respond pretty quickly. So I think that would be the best 2 ways to get a hold of me.
That's perfect. And we'll provide the links to the Rocket Model, to your LinkedIn URL. And we'll also provide a link back to the book, Ignition, A Guide to Building High-Performing Teams, on Amazon on our show notes as well. Gordy, it's a pleasure to go beyond just commenting on occasion to each other's posts and actually have a conversation with you virtual, but I can see you, you can see me, and it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate the time.
There you have it, folks. We have just been chatting with Gordy Curphy, a managing partner at Curphy Leadership Solutions. Gordy has over 30 years of education experience in all leadership matters. And in addition to all those books he's published, we've had a chance to kind of talk a little bit about his career, the work that he has been doing, and his passion for building high-performing teams, and talked a little bit about this book, Ignition, A Guide to Building High-Performing Teams, which he co-authored with his partner, Dianne Nilsen, and his mentor, as he described, Robert Hogan. And so we truly appreciate those acknowledgments as well. This is not our typical book author lately. We do a lot of children's books. We've had authors come on and talk about healthcare issues. We even have a zombie apocalypse novel in the mix within our podcast library. So this topic today on leadership and professional development, developing high-performing teams, this is a little bit more into my wheelhouse on the coaching side. So it was really nice to come on and learn about and to really meet Gordy virtually and to talk about his newest book, Ignition. So hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And remember, folks, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, go out there, have a phenomenal day, and think about what's next in your organization. Take care now.
Success Insight is a production of Fox Coaching and First Story Strategies. Find us online, successinsightpodcast.com.